Flatwoods, Braxton County, West Virginia, September the 12th, 1952. The sun had long since set behind the hills of Braxton County. It was dark and cold, and late, Kathleen May thought to herself. Too late to be playing games, to be traipsing across some muddy field in the middle of nowhere. What would the neighbors think of her, rushing out into the darkness on some wild goose chase, looking for... well, for what? Her two young sons, Edward and Fred, had been out earlier, playing in the woods with their friend, Tommy Hyer. All three of them had come tumbling through Kathleen's front door an hour or so earlier, shouting in excitement and hollering about bright lights in the sky, falling stars, and men from the moon. When Kathleen had finally managed to calm them down sufficiently to get a coherent story, the boys told her they had seen a shining object streaking across the darkening sky, trailing a plume of fire and sparks. The light had soared over Braxton County and seemed to land somewhere in the hills over by Fisher Farm. The boys had tugged at her skirts, pleading with her to come with them and investigate. They had been so earnest, so honestly excited, and, Kathleen thought, more than a little scared, that she had agreed almost at once. She had hastily pulled on her coat and hurried from the house, following her sons out into the darkness. Little did she know she was about to be part of one of the most horrifying extraterrestrial encounters in American history, and come face to face with a creature from the depths of the darkest nightmares. The Monsters from Another World, a bite-sized fright. This series contains disturbing content. Listener discretion is advised. Kathleen and the boys had hurried through the darkening streets. On the way towards Fisher Farm, they had stopped by the home of Eugene Lemon, a capable young man who was a member of the West Virginia National Guard. He had grabbed his flashlight and, along with a handful of other locals and a couple of stray dogs, had agreed to accompany Kathleen and her sons on their hunt for a fallen star. And so here they were, trudging uphill in the moonless night. It was oppressively dark. The beams from their flashlights seemed pale and feeble, struggling to dispel the blackness. Kathleen glanced back over her shoulder. The lights of Flatwoods, the tiny town that she called home, twinkled enticingly in the valley far below. She shivered. A feeling of unease was beginning to spread through her body, an unplaceable sense of dread that made her skin crawl. The night air seemed to have an odd, almost metallic taste on her tongue. Kathleen noticed that the rest of the group had fallen quiet. The boys, who had at first hurried forward, impatient at the perceived slowness of the adults, had gradually huddled closer together, and were now slinking along behind their mother, jumping at shadows. The group entered a patch of woodland that marked the boundary of Fisher Farm. Nobody spoke a word. They picked their way carefully through the tangled undergrowth. Their flashlights created monstrous, looming shadows in the darkness, turning branches into skeletal, grasping hands that seemed to snatch at them as they passed. Kathleen squinted through the gloom. Were her eyes playing tricks on her, or was there a faint, orange glow up ahead in the distance, like the first light of dawn? That was impossible. Morning was still many, long, dark hours away. As they crept closer, she became sure of it. There was a warm glow that pulsed and flickered like firelight. One of the dogs that had followed them up from the town began to bark ferociously, the sudden noise causing Kathleen's heart to leap in her chest. The dog streaked off ahead through the dark trees, growling and snarling as it went. For a few seconds, a volley of vicious barks echoed through the woods. Then silence fell. The group crept forward, hardly daring to breathe. The trees around them began to thin. They could now see the crest of the hill, 50 feet or so ahead of them. Kathleen gasped and took an involuntary step backwards. Her hands groped in the darkness for her two small sons, and she pulled them close. A huge, fiery sphere of red light was hovering just above the hilltop, glowing like a miniature sun. Thick Discolored mist seemed to be pouring from this pulsing light, creeping over the grass and swirling around their ankles. A foul smell filled the air, sulphurous and rotten. Kathleen felt sick to her stomach. She glanced around. The rest of the group was staring, transfixed by the shimmering orb, their faces bathed red in its ruddy glow. She could hear a low, droning hum, building in intensity, reverberating across the hillside. It made her teeth ache. Icy dread flooded Kathleen's body. Her skin was crawling. She had seen enough for one night. It was time to leave. A sudden crashing in the undergrowth to her left made her wheel around. She caught a glimpse of the dog as it tore past her, eyes bulging, tail between its legs, whimpering and yelping pathetically. Kathleen peered into the gloom in the direction the animal had come from. Two huge, blank eyes the size of dinner plates gleamed in the darkness, high up amidst the branches of the trees. They seemed to be bobbing slowly towards Kathleen, glowing with a ghostly, greenish-red light. Eugene Lemon had seen the eyes, too. He thrust his flashlight forward in shaking hands, directing the beam towards the hovering orbs. The feeble light illuminated a monstrous figure, a nightmarish being that loomed at least 12 feet tall, great eyes glowing like fiery lamps in a featureless, round face. The creature was vaguely humanoid in shape, covered in what looked like blackened, rippling metal scales. These encased its body like some unearthly armor, rising to form a pointed hood that framed those terrible, bulbous eyes. As Kathleen watched in numb terror, two spindly, spider-like arms unfolded themselves from the monster's chest, tipped with grasping, clawed fingers. They twitched spasmodically in the darkness, like the antennae of some colossal insect. A hideous, shrieking hiss filled the air. The piercing sound rattled in Kathleen's chest, so horrifyingly unnatural that all she wanted to do was block it out, to cover her ears with her hands and scream. The creature suddenly lurched towards her, seeming to glide over the forest floor like some monstrous, metallic ghost. Its glaring eyes blazed with light, pupilless and blank, like twin portals to some hellish dimension. Eugene Lemon dropped his flashlight and fled, sprinting away through the shadowy trees. Kathleen followed, dragging her sons along behind her. Fear gave her strength as she plowed through the undergrowth. Branches whipped her face and thorns tore at her skin, but she felt nothing. She knew the creature must be right behind her, reaching out with those grasping, spidery arms, ready to pull her close. She risked a glance back over her shoulder. The terrifying thing stood motionless, a looming silhouette backlit by the glow from the fiery sphere that still hovered over Fisher Farm. Its eyes burned with a furious light as that dreadful, hissing screech split the air once more. Kathleen May turned and ran for her life. When Kathleen May finally reached her home later that night, the first thing she did was alert the town sheriff and then a reporter for the local paper. It turned out the sheriff and his deputy were already out in the wooded hills around Flatwoods, investigating reports of a mysterious, crashed aircraft. As such, the reporter, Lee Stewart Jr. of the Braxton Democrat, made it to Fisher Farm first. He later wrote that a sickening, burnt metallic smell had been lingering over the area, and that he had discovered what looked like skid marks in the grass, along with traces of an odd, gummy black liquid. When the sheriff and his deputies arrived to search the farm, all armed with shotguns, they reportedly found and smelled nothing out of the ordinary. However, this did little to squash the rumors of UFOs, monsters in the woods, and visitors from outer space. The story quickly spread nationwide, splashed across newspaper pages and large network radio broadcasts. The United States Air Force even sent agents to investigate the bizarre claims. The terrifying creature that Kathleen May and the others had allegedly encountered was soon dubbed the Flatwoods Monster. Of course, there were those who were quick to claim the entire incident was an elaborate hoax, or a case of mistaken identity. The official suggestion was that the bright light initially seen streaking across the sky was a meteor, burning up in the Earth's atmosphere. The pulsing red glow atop the hill at Fisher Farm was said to be nothing more than an aircraft warning beacon, while the monster itself merely a large barn owl defending its territory. The nausea and creeping feelings of dread experienced by the group were attributed to hysteria and overexertion. And while these explanations may sound plausible enough, there were a number of other odd events that occurred across Braxton County that night that might add weight to Kathleen May's terrifying tale. A woman who lived close to Fisher Farm claimed that at around the time the boys had seen the shining object streak across the sky, her house had been shaken violently by some nearby impact. Her radio had issued nothing but static for 45 minutes afterwards. Many locals reported seeing odd lights in the sky over Flatwoods on the night of September the 12th. The morning after the creature was allegedly sighted, the director of the local Board of Education claimed to have seen a flying saucer rising from the wooded hills and taking off into the sky. Stories began to circulate of a local woman and her 21-year-old daughter who had also encountered a monstrous creature in the woods only a week before. They described being approached by a tall being very similar in appearance to the Flatwoods monster, right down to the foul, odorous smoke that preceded it. The horrifying encounter apparently affected the daughter so badly that she was hospitalized for 3 weeks. Then, on September the 13th, 1952, Edith and George Snitovsky and their 18-month-old son were driving along the mountain roads near Frametown, West Virginia. Frametown is located approximately 20 miles southwest of Flatwoods, where Kathleen May had encountered that terrible creature in the woods only the night before. The Snitovskys were on their way home to New York. They planned to drive all through the night if necessary. All seemed well as they wound their way along the deserted mountain roads surrounded by thick, shadowy pine forests. However, as they rounded a corner, the car's engine suddenly sputtered, then stalled, and finally died altogether, leaving the family stranded by the side of the road. George jumped out of the car and tried his best to fix the engine, but it was hopeless. Nothing seemed to be wrong with it. The damn thing just wouldn't start back up. As he tinkered with the engine, George became aware of a thick, pungent mist that was beginning to swirl in the air around him, accompanied by a nauseating, sulphurous stench that made his eyes water. He started to feel rather uneasy, exposed as he was out in the darkness. George hurried back round to the driver's door, but as he did so, he spotted an odd, glowing light moving in the trees by the side of the road. Hunters, perhaps. George wasn't sure, but he needed help, so he took a few tentative steps forward into the dark forest. The reeking fog was thicker here amongst the trees. George covered his face with his sleeve as the foul stench was almost making him retch. The glowing light was stronger here too, though George could not pinpoint its source. He glanced up. A huge, pulsing sphere hovered a few feet above the treetops. Crackling strands of electricity filled the air, rippling through the branches. The hairs on George's arms stood stiff and straight. His skin tingled with static. Fear washed through his body in a sickening wave. He turned and ran back towards the car. As George approached the vehicle, he could just make out his wife Edith's round, white face through the back window. Her mouth was open and screaming. She seemed to be wildly pointing at a spot somewhere behind George. He wheeled around. His legs almost buckled beneath him. A monstrous shape was emerging from the dark trees. It was at least 9 feet tall, the lower part of its body almost lost behind the billowing tendrils of noxious smoke that now seemed to be emanating from the creature itself. Its top half was something from the depths of a nightmare. A bloated, reptilian body with long, spindly arms that ended in 2 grasping, claw-like fingers. Its head was huge, with thick, rubbery skin and vast, yellow-green eyes that glowed like lamps. The creature moved towards George through the curling clouds of stinking fog, seeming to hover, drifting silently a few inches above the ground. George hurled himself backwards, wrenched open the car door, and leapt inside. He slammed the door shut and scrambled desperately away from the window. Edith was cowering in the back seat, their infant son clutched protectively to her chest. Both were screaming in fright, staring with bulging eyes at the enormous, reptilian shape that glared back at them from the darkness. According to the Snitovskys, the monstrous creature had then begun to circle their stranded vehicle like a hungry shark, occasionally floating closer to peer in at the terrified occupants. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably no longer than a few moments, the bizarre monster glided off into the dark forest and vanished. Ufologists have speculated that the creature that stalked this terrified family, and the one witnessed by Kathleen May and her sons, are one and the same. They theorize that the metallic skin and pointed hood of the Flatwoods monster was some form of exoskeleton or armor, hiding the true, hideous reptilian form of the creature inside. The state of West Virginia seems to have more than its fair share of mysterious, monstrous inhabitants. Why it is such a hotspot for unexplained activity is unknown, but aside from the Flatwoods monster, there have been reported encounters with aggressive, Bigfoot-like creatures, enormous winged beasts, and sinister, grinning alien beings. There are stories of thunderbirds, shadow people, devil dogs, the Grafton monster, beastmen, and 100 other hideous creatures said to roam the wooded hills in the dead of night. And then, of course, we have the most infamous West Virginian monster, the legendary Mothman. This horrifying being was sighted by dozens of residents around the area of Point Pleasant in 1966 and 1967. Many claimed to have been pursued by this flying nightmare as they drove home alone at night, before it returned to its sinister lair in an abandoned munitions factory. Said to be an omen of evil, the Mothman became fixed in urban legend after the collapse of the Silver Bridge, which resulted in the tragic deaths of 46 people. Numerous witnesses came forward to say they had seen the bizarre creature perched high on the bridge's girders moments before its devastating collapse. But there will be more about Mothman in another episode. On the night Kathleen May and the others encountered the Flatwoods monster, odd events of an extraterrestrial nature were by no means limited to West Virginia. Balls of fire were reported in the night sky above 4 different states along the eastern seaboard. Police stations, newspaper offices, and government agencies were swamped with calls of aeroplanes plunging from the sky in flames. Many feared a repeat of the events that had occurred just 6 weeks earlier in Washington, D.C., where thousands witnessed disturbing lights floating over the nation's capital before they streaked away through the night at impossible speeds. Around 90 minutes before the alleged encounter, U.S. Air Force pilot Lieutenant John Jones and his Lockheed F-94C Starfire jet vanished without a trace, somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico. Lieutenant Jones had been flying a routine training mission from a Florida Air Force base, accompanied by 3 other aircraft, when he inexplicably disappeared from radar into thin air. A massive rescue operation was launched, but no wreckage or body was ever found. While this tragic disappearance may initially seem unrelated, it later emerged that there had been numerous sightings of odd, unidentified aircraft in the region at around the time the Starfire vanished. The U.S. Air Force officially denied any such incident ever took place. However, when asked about the sudden increase in UFO sightings across America, General Benjamin W. Chidlaw, the commander of the U.S. Air Force in the early 1950s, had this response. "We have stacks of reports of flying saucers. We take them seriously when you consider that we have lost many men and aircraft trying to intercept them." With this in mind, perhaps Kathleen May's claims of crashed spacecraft and close encounters with a monstrous, unearthly being are not so far-fetched after all. And if the Flatwoods monster incident was just a hoax, it was an imaginative and believable one. Reports from the time all seem to agree that Kathleen May and the other Flatwoods residents who claimed to have witnessed the odd happenings that September night all showed signs of genuine terror. They stuck rigidly to their stories for over 50 years. It certainly seemed that they truly believed they had met a monster in those dark woods. and they were not alone. The 1950s marked an explosion of UFO sightings and extraterrestrial encounters across the United States. Increasingly bizarre reports from that time still baffle investigators to this day. A shootout at a rural farm besieged by glowing, metallic goblins, monstrous, tentacled entities with translucent cubes for heads floating outside bedroom windows. 2 friends attacked by giant, stinking blobs of gelatinous ooze on a deserted highway. But these are stories for another time. What do you think? Did Kathleen May and the others really encounter a monstrous, metallic creature from another world? Can all the thousands of sightings of alien spacecraft and reported meetings with unearthly beings all really be fraudulent, or cases of mistaken identity? On the other hand, if these intergalactic visitors are real, what are their intentions down here on Earth? What do they want from us? We would love to hear your own thoughts and ideas about these creepy, close encounters. If you have enjoyed this episode, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Pixel Elixir, or subscribe at bitesizedfrights.com so that you never miss any of our terrifying tales. This has been a Pixel Elixir production, narrated by Chris K. Thank you for listening. Until the next bite, my friend.